friend. Welcome to your sleep story. My name is Liam O'Connor, an Irish storyteller from the green hills of Connemara, where the nights are filled with the soft whisper of the wind and the distant call of the sea. It's my great privilege to be the voice that guides you to sleep tonight, a gentle companion in this quiet moment. Tonight I begin a new series where we meet very boring people, folks who find peace in their simple lives. And there's no judgment here, not a bit. A touch of boring can be a beautiful thing, can't it? Tonight we'll meet Thomas and Margaret, the most unremarkable couple in the world, and listen to a day in their perfectly ordinary lives. I hope you'll find it soothing. And if you'd like to support my stories, there's a Patreon link below this video. But for now, let's drift into calm together. I'll count down from 10 to 1, and with each number allow yourself to let go just a little more, as if you're sinking into a warm, soft cloud. Feel the gentle support of the bed beneath you, or the floor, or whatever surface cradles you tonight. Notice how it holds you, steady and kind. And beneath that, imagine the deep, endless support of the earth, our home, our foundation. It's always there, a constant, unchanging presence like the roots of an old oak tree stretching into the soil. As you become aware of this, see if you can let go of a little tension. Just a breath's worth. Let your shoulders soften, your hands relax, a little more with each moment. Now turn your attention inward, to your body. Where are you still holding on? Perhaps it's in your toes, curled slightly from the day, or your feet resting but not quite at ease. Maybe it's in your legs, your hips, or that quiet ache in your back. Or perhaps, like me, you carry it in your hands, clenched without knowing, or around your eyes, where the day's worries linger. As you lie here, becoming aware of that holding, notice how simply noticing it begins to ease it away. Let it drift. Let it go now, like a leaf falling gently to the ground. You are safe here. Let my voice be your friend tonight, a soft guide through this peaceful journey. Know that I'll only lead you to calm, safe places. Places where the world is kind, where the night wraps around you like a blanket. Can you feel that safety? Can you trust it just a little? Perhaps you'll find a small spark of joy in your heart, a quiet light that grows as we move closer to sleep, step by gentle step. The day is behind you now. Whatever has happened, and whatever will come can wait until morning. Any thoughts that drift into your mind, plans, worries, little memories, just see them for what they are. Thoughts. A natural part of being human, but not you. You don't need to chase them. Let them float away like leaves carried on a moonlit river, or clouds drifting slowly across a starlit sky fading into the distance. This is your time, your moment. Let that settle into you now, like a warm glow spreading through your chest. Feel the coziness of lying here, the simple joy of listening to a story as the world grows quiet. You deserve this rest, this peace, this gentle escape from the day's rhythm. Peace is within you, always. It's there, waiting patiently like a candle flickering in a still room ready to be noticed. See if you can find it tonight, perhaps in the softness of your breath, or the warmth of the air around you. And maybe, just maybe, let a little gratitude rise. Gratitude for the roof above you, the softness beneath you, the steady beat of your heart. Begin to let your imagination wander now. Picture a very boring house on a very boring lane, a place where the stones are grey, the garden is still, and the rain falls softly. Inside, a very boring couple waits their day unfolding with quiet care. Let that image form, slow and gentle, like mist settling over a field. Check in with your body one more time. It's carried you through today with such strength. Now it's time to let it rest. Feel your legs grow heavy, your arms sink into the bed. Your breath deepen as you give it the gift of stillness. You're almost there. Let every muscle soften. Let every thought fade. Completely letting go now as I share tonight's sleep story. They met on a day that couldn't quite commit to sunshine or clouds, settling instead for a polite, even grey that draped the village like a soft veil. The air carried a hint of damp earth and distant wood smoke, a scent that lingered as she stood in the hardware aisle of the village shop, her fingers tracing the rough edges of two nearly identical rolls of twine. The twine was coarse, its fibres catching faintly under her touch, and she turned each roll over twice, as if the decision might reveal itself in the texture. He was there for a hammer, his gaze lingering on the shelf where two options waited. One with a wooden handle, its grain worn smooth by unseen hands. The other with a rubber grip, slightly newer, but less familiar. He hadn't decided, his eyes shifting between them with a quiet deliberation as if the choice might shape the rest of his day, though it never would. Their baskets passed each other with the slow certainty of planets in a quiet orbit, the wicker brushing softly against the aisle's edge. He gave a small nod, a gesture as understated as the day itself, and she returned it, her head tilting just enough to acknowledge him. No words were exchanged, the silence between them as natural as the rain that threatened but hadn't yet fallen. It wasn't until by some unspoken agreement they both realised they'd forgotten to buy potatoes that their paths converged again. They walked back to the vegetable section together, side by side, with no hurry, their steps matching the soft patter of their thoughts. The potatoes were nestled in a wooden crate, their skins dusted with soil, and they each selected one, their hands moving in unison without a glance. They found themselves at the same till again. The shopkeepers murmur a distant hum, and by the time their goods were bagged, twine, hammer, potatoes, they'd arranged to share tea the following Thursday. Not Wednesday, that was too sudden, too bold for a day like this. That was 8 years ago, a memory as faded as the shop's wooden floor. Now they lived in a modest cottage on a lane that boasted no particular charm, its cobblestones uneven under a thin layer of moss. The stone walls were a faded grey, weathered by time and softened by the occasional vine that clung without thriving, its leaves sparse but persistent. The garden was neither wild nor manicured, a patch of grass dotted with a single rose bush that bloomed once a year, its petals a pale pink that lasted only a week before falling to the earth. The front door bore a coat of paint that might once have been green but had settled into something closer to moss, its surface smooth under the rain's gentle touch, the handle cool and slightly rusted. Inside, the furniture was practical. A sofa with no bold patterns, its cushions slightly worn from years of quiet sitting, its fabric a neutral beige that blended with the walls. The chairs matched by accident, their wood darkened by time, and the curtains hung unassumingly, letting in light but not attention, their hem brushing the floor with a soft whisper. On this particular morning, rain fell in a steady, unhurried drizzle, each drop a soft tap against the window panes. a rhythm that seemed to pulse with the cottage's heartbeat. The sky was a uniform grey, a blanket that muted the world, making the hour hard to pin without glancing at the clock, which ticked quietly on the mantel, its face marked with Roman numerals that gleamed faintly in the dim light. In the sitting room, their dog, Rufus, lay sprawled on a rug near the hearth, his brown and black coat blending with the faded threads, a patchwork of shadows and stillness. Rufus was the sort of dog who didn't chase sticks, his energy reserved for the occasional stretch, seldom barked unless the wind rattled the windows, and seemed to view wagging his tail as an occasional courtesy, a brief flick that faded as quickly as it came. His breaths were slow and even, a soft rise and fall that matched the rain's cadence. The couple sat in their armchairs, Thomas in one, Margaret in the other, not because they'd chosen them as a set, but because time had nudged them toward the same sturdy design, their outlines softened by the dim light filtering through the curtains. The chairs creaked faintly under their weight, a sound as familiar as their breathing. She was knitting something that might one day be a scarf, her needles clicking faintly, a sound like distant raindrops, pausing every few stitches to squint at the yarn. The wool was a soft grey, the colour of the sky outside, and she held it up to the light, as if unsure it was the right shade, her fingers tracing its loops with a care that bordered on reverence. He was gazing at the fireplace, where a low fire crackled, its embers glowing like tiny stars, holding a newspaper he hadn't opened, its pages crisp but unread, the ink smelling faintly of ink and paper. Between them on a low table sat 2 cups of tea, cooled to a temperature that invited sipping but not enthusiasm, the steam long gone, leaving only the faint aroma of chamomile to linger in the air. They didn't speak. The silence wasn't something to fill, it was a shared space, comfortable and optional, like the space between the raindrops or the pause between Rufus's breaths. The rain tapped gently on the window, a steady rhythm that filled the room without demand, and Rufus shifted slightly on his rug, his paw twitching as if dreaming of a quieter place. Somewhere in the kitchen the kettle gave a faint, resigned click before settling into stillness, its sound a soft echo in the distance. The tea remained untouched for nearly half an hour. It wasn't forgotten. Both were aware of it, much like the rain outside, its presence a quiet companion in the room. But there was no rush to bridge the gap between noticing and acting, no urgency to disturb the stillness they'd built. Eventually, Margaret reached for her cup, her fingers wrapping around the handle with a gentleness that matched the rain's fall, lifting it just enough to test its warmth against her lips. She set it back without drinking, the motion as deliberate as the drizzle's descent, cup settling with a soft clink against the saucer. Thomas watched this without remark, his eyes following her hand, then mirrored her action moments later, as if verifying her assessment, his fingers steady on the handle, the tea's surface rippling faintly. The rain outside held steady, suggesting it had no plans to leave, its rhythm a soft lullaby against the glass, painting the world in muted shades of grey and silver. Neither had suggested stepping out. There was nowhere pressing to go, no errand urgent enough to break the spell of the morning. Both agreed rain was best watched through panes, where it transformed the garden into a watercolour blur, the rose bush a faint shadow against the stones. The fire crackled again, a small spark flaring briefly before fading, and Rufus let out a soft sigh, his head resting heavier on the rug. The day stretched before them, unhurried, a canvas of quiet moments waiting to unfold. At 10:13 a.m, Thomas stood, not quickly, not slowly, just stood, his movement as unhurried as the rain that draped the cottage in its gentle embrace. The chair creaked softly beneath him, a sound as familiar as the ticking clock on the mantel, its rhythm blending with the drizzle's patter. Rufus, midway through doing nothing, lifted one ear, the motion barely perceptible, then let it drop, his head resting back on the rug with a quiet thud. His brown and black coat shimmered faintly in the hearth's glow, a patchwork of shadows that seemed to shift with the fire's breath. Thomas crossed to a small bookshelf tucked against the wall, its shelves lined with books he'd collected but seldom read, their spines faded from neglect, the edges softened by dust that had settled over years. He stood before it, not to select a volume, but because it was something to do, his eyes tracing the titles with a slow, wandering gaze. Gardening manuals with yellowed pages, a book on trains with a cracked cover, another on weather patterns that promised insights he'd never sought. The wood of the shelf was cool under his fingertips, its grain rough yet comforting, and he lingered there, as if the act of looking might fill the morning stillness. After a moment he picked up a volume on gardening, its cover worn but unopened, the title embossed in fading gold, The Art of the Hedge. He'd never turned its pages, but liked to keep it for its weight, a quiet promise of tasks undone, and carried it back to his chair, setting it on his lap with a soft thud, the book resting like a companion. Margaret, meanwhile, had set her knitting aside, the grey wool coiled in her lap like a sleeping cat, its softness a contrast to the hard needles she'd placed down. She used a spare needle to mark her place, the metal glinting briefly in the dim light, and adjusted her shawl slightly, pulling it closer to her shoulders. The fabric was a faded blue, its edges frayed from wear, not from cold, for the room was warm from the hearth's glow, its heat seeping into the stones. But because the adjustment had been pending and this morning felt as good as any, the shawl settling against her skin like a familiar friend. Her fingers brushed the collar, smoothing it with a care that mirrored the rain's gentle fall. Rufus rose, stretched in that deliberate way dogs do, his limbs extending with a quiet grace, each muscle unfolding like a flower opening to the dawn. He padded slowly toward Thomas's chair, his paws leaving faint impressions on the rug, and paused just short of touching his nose inches from Thomas's knee. He sat and began a half-hearted lick of his paw, his tongue moving in small, deliberate strokes, the motion hypnotic in its simplicity. But he lost interest midway, his head tilting as if reconsidering, and after a thoughtful pause he stood again, ambling out of the room with the soft click of his nails against the floor. His tail neither high nor low, simply there, a neutral line against the grey light filtering through the curtains. Thomas glanced toward the doorway Rufus had exited, as if noting his absence, his eyes lingering on the empty space where the dog's shadow had been. The air seemed quieter without Rufus's presence, the hearth's crackle filling the void with a low hum. Margaret looked at the clock on the mantel. Still not time for lunch, though the idea hovered faintly, like a tune from a distant radio, its melody soft and indistinct, carried on the breeze that slipped through a crack in the window. The clock's hands moved with a steady tick, its face marked with Roman numerals that gleamed faintly, a silent witness to their days. Their names, by the way, were Thomas and Margaret. Not Tom or Maggie, just Thomas. Just Margaret. Nicknames suggested a familiarity they'd outgrown, having known each other long enough to need no shortcuts. Their bond a quiet thread woven through years of shared silence. Thomas had once been a clerk at a post office, where he sorted letters with a precision that never wavered, his days marked by the rustle of paper and the faint scent of ink. He'd explain stamp values in a tone as flat as the envelopes, his voice a monotone that carried no enthusiasm, only fact. He'd been retired for some years, though the exact count eluded him unless he paused to tally, the numbers slipping away like sand through his fingers, lost in the rhythm of the rain. Margaret had worked in a library, reshelving books at a pace that never rushed, her days filled with the soft rustle of pages and the musty smell of old leather. She'd move each volume with care, her fingers tracing the spines as if memorizing their stories, until the shelves grew quiet and she stopped going in, the silence a companion she'd grown to love, its weight as comforting as the shawl around her shoulders. They had no children, not from dislike, but because the notion never pressed itself upon them, its urgency lost in the gentle flow of their days. Instead, they had Rufus offered company in the broadest sense. His presence was certain, a warm weight in the room, but his interest in chatter was nil, his gaze often fixed on some unseen horizon, as if dreaming of fields beyond the cottage. In appearance, Thomas and Margaret were neither striking nor easily forgotten. Thomas's hair had thinned but lingered, a silver fringe against his scalp that caught the firelight. His spectacles perched squarely on his nose, their lenses smudged with the faintest trace of fingerprints. His cardigan spanned a muted palette, grey, beige, brown, that blended with the cottage's stones, their wool soft against his skin. Margaret kept her hair in a practical bob, long enough to avoid remark, its ends brushing her collar with a gentle sway, and favoured dresses that ended just below the knee, their fabric soft and unadorned, a pale green that echoed the moss outside. They didn't dress alike, yet seated together, they gave the impression of a pair deliberately arranged, their stillness a mirror of the room, their breaths sinking with the rain's fall. At 11:05 a.m, Margaret stood. She didn't declare it, simply placed her knitting on the armrest and rose, as if she might sit back at any moment, her movement fluid but unhurried, the shawl slipping slightly before she adjusted it. Thomas followed her progress with his eyes, not his head, tracking a familiar pattern, his gaze steady as the rain, the firelight reflecting in his glasses. She moved to the window, where the drizzle continued its gentle fall, each drop a tiny prism against the glass, catching the grey light in fleeting sparkles. She stood there a while, not expecting change, but acknowledging its persistence, the coolness of the pain seeping through her fingers, a contrast to the warmth at her back. After a few moments, she drew the curtain an inch or two, the fabric rustling softly as it settled, its hem brushing the sill with a whisper. The rain outside painted the garden in muted shades, the rose bush a faint shadow against the stones, its petals long gone but its thorns still visible. The room grew a shade dimmer with the curtain's shift, the hearth's glow taking precedence, its embers pulsing like a heartbeat. Thomas watched her return, his hands resting on the gardening book. Its weight, a quiet comfort. And the morning stretched before them, unhurried. The canvas of quiet moments waiting to unfold into the day's next rhythm. Thomas shifted in his chair, the wood creaking softly beneath him, a sound that blended with the hearth's low crackle and the steady patter of rain against the window panes. He leaned forward slightly, his movements deliberate, and placed the gardening book on the table between them, its cover worn but unopened. The title, The Art of the Hedge, embossed in fading gold that caught the dim light. The book's weight settled with a soft thud, a quiet anchor in the room, its pages untouched but promising a world of quiet tasks he'd never undertake. He hadn't turned a page but liked its presence there, unhurried, a companion to the stillness that filled the cottage. His tea was now tepid, the chamomile scent faint but lingering, and he reached for the cup, his fingers wrapping around the handle with a gentleness that mirrored the rain's fall. He took a sip, winced faintly at the chill, and set it back, aligning the handle with the table's edge, the motion precise as a ritual, the porcelain clinking softly against the wood. Rufus reappeared in the doorway, his brown and black coat a shadow against the grey light, pausing to survey the room with a slow, appraising look, his eyes half-lidded as if weighing the day's events. He walked in, his paws leaving faint impressions on the rug, tail in its usual neutral state, a straight line that neither rose nor fell, a quiet statement of his presence. He sat before Thomas's chair, his body a soft weight in the space, his nose inches from the floor, sniffing the air with a faint curiosity that faded as quickly as it came. The notion of lunch began to form, unspoken, hovering like the rain outside, its presence felt but not acknowledged, a gentle pressure in the air that neither rushed to address. Thomas glanced at the clock. 11:17. The hands moved with a steady tick, its face marked with Roman numerals that gleamed faintly, a silent witness to their days. Lunch was at 12:30, as always, a rhythm etched into their lives, and there was no need to rush, the minutes stretching out like the drizzle's fall, each one a soft thread in the tapestry of the morning. Margaret returned to her chair, the floorboards creaking under her step, picking up her knitting but not resuming. The grey wool coiled in her lap, its softness a contrast to the hard needles she held, and she studied it a moment as if questioning its shade. Grey, like the sky, like the stones outside. She set it down, her hands resting still, the needles clicking once as they settled. A sound that echoed the rain's rhythm. The rain pattered on, a steady cadence filling the room without demand, its sound blending with the hearth's low hum, a duet of nature and comfort. Rufus, after sitting a while, moved to Margaret's chair, his paws brushing the rug with a soft shuffle. He began another brief paw wash, his tongue moving in small, deliberate strokes, the motion hypnotic in its simplicity, a ritual as old as the cottage itself. But he lost interest midway, his head tilting as if reconsidering, and departed again, his steps fading into the kitchen's silence, leaving a quiet void in his wake. They watched without comment, as if it were a ritual they'd seen countless times, its familiarity a comfort, a thread in the fabric of their days. Thomas picked up the remote, its plastic cool against his palm, and turned on the television, the screen flickering to life with a soft hum. He selected a channel, showing a programme about gardening. The volume low, just enough to hear the narrator's voice. A man pruning roses with a care they'd never muster, his hands steady as he clipped each stem. The colours on the screen were muted, the roses a pale red against green leaves, a contrast to the grey outside. Margaret nodded slightly, approving of the choice, her head tilting in quiet agreement, the shawl slipping an inch before she adjusted it, her fingers brushing the fabric with a care that matched the rain's gentleness. At 12 o'clock, Thomas stood, the chair creaking again as he rose, his shadow stretching across the rug. "Lunch?" he said, in a tone neither questioning nor commanding, merely stating the word, a soft anchor in the air, its sound blending with the rain's fall. Margaret set her knitting aside, marking it with the needle, its metal glinting briefly, and rose, her movements mirroring his, the floorboards sighing under her weight. Rufus, sensing the shift, returned to his rug, settling with a quiet huff, his body curling into a loose circle, his breaths steady as the drizzle outside. In the kitchen they prepared lunch together. Not a collaboration, but the way it had always been, a dance of quiet motions etched into their days. The air carried the faint scent of tin as Thomas went to the cupboard where the soup lived, its shelves lined with cans on the second level to the left of the pasta, a place as familiar as his own hands. He looked along the row of tins as if rediscovering it each time, his fingers brushing the labels, and took out 2 identical cans, checking them with a care that bordered on ceremony, setting them on the counter with the labels facing the same way, their edges aligned. Margaret retrieved the bread from the bread bin, 2 slices each as always, the loaf's crust crackling softly under her touch, and placed it beside the breadboard. The butter came from the fridge, its wrapper crinkling as she unwrapped it, and was set in perfect parallel to the board, a geometry of habit. No one spoke, but the sounds of the tin opener and the butter knife provided all the atmosphere they needed. A symphony of metal against metal, soft scrapes against bread. The soup heated slowly on the stove, its steam rising in lazy curls, the scent of vegetables and broth filling the room, a warmth that seeped into the stones. They both watched as if it might suddenly misbehave, though it never had, their eyes following the bubbles that broke the surface with a gentle pop. When it was ready, Thomas ladled it evenly into the bowls, the spoon clinking against the ceramic, while Margaret placed the bread on small side plates and buttered each slice with the same steady pressure from edge to edge, the knife gliding like a pendulum, leaving a smooth sheen. They carried everything into the living room, the bowls warm in their hands, and ate without hurry, the spoons moving in a rhythm that matched the rain's fall. Occasionally Thomas would look up from his bowl to glance at Rufus, his eyes meeting the dog's for a brief moment. Rufus, in turn, would open one eye, the amber glint catching the firelight, before returning to the important business of doing nothing, his head sinking back to the rug. When the bowls were empty, Margaret gathered the plates and carried them to the kitchen, stacking them neatly in the sink, the ceramic clinking softly. Neither of them mentioned washing up. It would be done later, a task deferred to the afternoon's quiet stretch. Back in their chairs, they settled into the long expanse of afternoon, the rain unchanged outside, its droplets tracing paths down the glass. Inside, neither had they, their stillness a mirror to the world beyond the walls. The afternoon began as it often did, with neither of them suggesting anything to do. This was not laziness so much as the quiet understanding that anything worth doing would have made itself known by now, its call lost in the drizzle's hum. Instead, they remained in their chairs, the fire's glow casting soft shadows across the room. The television's murmur, a faint undertone to the day's rhythm. At 4 p.m, Margaret rose from her chair, the wood creaking softly beneath her, a sound that merged with the hearth's low crackle and the rain's steady patter against the window panes. The room had grown dimmer as the day waned, the grey light filtering through the curtains, casting long shadows across the rug where Rufus lay. She moved to the kitchen with a quiet purpose, her shawl brushing against her side, its faded blue fabric swaying gently with each step. The air carried the faint scent of the morning soup, now a memory in the stillness, as she reached for the kettle, its metal cool under her fingers. She filled it with water from the tap, the soft trickle blending with the rain, and set it on the stove. The click of the burner, igniting a brief interruption, before it settled into a low hum. Thomas watched her go, his eyes following the curve of her shadow against the wall, then returned to the gardening book on his lap, its pages still unturned, the weight a quiet comfort against his thighs. The fire had settled to a low glow, its embers pulsing like a heartbeat, casting a warm light that danced across the room, illuminating the faded spines of the bookshelf. Rufus stirred on his rug, lifting his head to sniff the air, his brown and black coat shimmering faintly in the glow, before settling back with a soft sigh, his body curling into a loose circle, his breath steady as the drizzle outside. The kettle whistled briefly, a sound that cut through the silence like a gentle wave, then faded as Margaret lifted it from the stove. She poured the water into 2 mugs, the steam rising in lazy curls, carrying the aroma of chamomile and a hint of honey. She added with a slow stir, the spoon clinking softly against the ceramic. She carried the mugs to the table, the warmth seeping into her palms, and set them down with a care that matched the rain's rhythm. They held them in silence, sipping slowly, the steam warming their faces, the liquid a gentle heat against their lips. The rain continued its gentle patter, a lullaby against the stones, and the room grew quieter still. The only sounds the soft clink of mugs and the distant tick of the clock. Dinner was decided at 6:30, the time as predictable as the rain's fall, a rhythm etched into their days. They moved to the kitchen together, not a collaboration but a shared habit, the floorboards creaking under their steps, the air filled with the scent of fish pie as Thomas slid it into the oven, the dish a simple layering of fish and potatoes, its edges crisping under the heat. Margaret prepared the carrots, peeling them with a steady hand, the knife gliding over the orange flesh with a soft scrape, the peels falling into a neat pile on the counter. The oven's warmth blended with the hearth's glow, a cocoon of heat that wrapped the cottage in comfort. And they worked without words, the silence a thread that bound them. They ate at the table, facing each other, the plates warm under their fingers, the rain a soft backdrop against the window. The fish pie was tender, the carrots soft, and they chewed with the same unhurried care, the forks moving in a rhythm that matched the drizzle's fall. No remarks passed between them, the meal a quiet communion. the clink of cutlery against ceramic the only sound. When the plates were empty, Margaret gathered them, stacking them neatly in the sink, the ceramic clinking softly, a promise of washing deferred to the night's end. Thomas wiped the table with a cloth, his movements slow and deliberate, the fabric smoothing the wood with a faint rustle. After dinner, they returned to the sitting room, the fire's light their only companion, its flicker painting shadows on the walls, the embers glowing like tiny stars against the dark. They sat by the hearth, Thomas in his chair, Margaret beside him on the sofa, the cushions sinking slightly under her weight. Rufus joined them, padding over to lie at their feet, his head resting on Thomas's shoe, his breaths a soft counterpoint to the rain. The television remained off, its silence a choice. The room filled instead with the crackle of the fire and the steady patter outside, a symphony of stillness that wrapped them in peace. Bedtime was at 10 o'clock, a ritual as old as the cottage itself. They rose together, the chairs creaking in unison, and moved to the bathroom, the floorboards cool under their feet. They brushed their teeth side by side, the mirror fogging softly from the warm water, their reflections blurred but familiar. The sound of the brush against enamel a quiet rhythm. Rufus was already on the bed, sprawled in his usual spot, his tail a gentle curve against the blanket, his body a warm weight in the night. They changed into their nightclothes, the fabric soft against their skin, and settled under the covers, the mattress sighing beneath them. They read a while. Thomas, with his gardening book, the pages turning with a soft rustle, the text about pruning hedges blurring into a gentle hum, Margaret with her knitting, the needles clicking in a slow dance, the grey wool growing stitch by stitch. The bedside lamp cast a warm, muted light, its glow softening the room's edges. The rain tapping a steady rhythm outside, a lullaby weaving through the night. At 10:30, Margaret reached for the switch, the light fading with a soft click, plunging the room into darkness save for the faint glow of the hearth through the open door. No good nights were needed. They were already there, their breaths sinking with the drizzle's fall, a quiet harmony in the night. The rain continued its soft patter, a gentle embrace against the windows, and the cottage settled into stillness, the stones holding the warmth of the day. Thomas and Margaret slept, their bodies relaxed, their dreams a mirror to the quiet world beyond. Rufus breathed evenly, a soft purr rising from his chest, the first sound of contentment he'd offered all day. Tomorrow would be much the same, rain or not, the routine unchanged. And that was just fine, a perfect end to a perfect, unremarkable day.